Winifred Alcott folded her husband's letter in half without finishing it, set it on the breakfast table beside the untouched cup of tea she had poured for herself an hour ago, and understood for the first time in 4 years of marriage that she had been reading the wrong document all along. The letter was from Gideon's business partner in Philadelphia. She had not meant to read it. She had gone to his study that morning to return a book she'd borrowed from his shelves. One of the surveying texts she'd taken to reading in the evenings when the house grew too quiet and her own thoughts too loud. And the letter had been open on the desk, weighted flat by his inkwell, the handwriting large and unhurried and clearly meant for no one's eyes but Gideon's. She had read 3 lines before she understood what she was unsee. And then she had read all of it. Then she had folded it in half, carried it to the breakfast table, and sat down very carefully, the way you sit when you are not entirely sure your legs will hold. If you have ever poured your life into a marriage that was only ever a transaction on the other side of it, this story belongs to you. The year was 1831. Winifred had come to Gideon Alcott's house in Connecticut at 23, the daughter of a paper merchant from Hartford whose business had collapsed under a debt he hadn't told anyone about until it was already too late to do anything but accept the terms that presented themselves. The terms in this case were Gideon. He was 41. He was respected. He owned a mill on the Farmington River, and a house large enough that Winifred had gotten lost in it the first week, and hadn't entirely admitted this to anyone. He was not cruel. She had told herself that many times in the years since. He was not cruel. He simply had no particular interest in her as a person, which was a different thing entirely, though it took her several years to understand the difference clearly enough to name it. She had arrived with a trunk, a list of household skills her mother had helped her compile, and the kind of hope that belongs specifically to young women who have been told that love follows duty, that affection grows with time, that a steady man is worth more than a thrilling one. She had believed all of it. She had wanted to believe all of it. What she had gotten instead was 4 years of managing a household of 11 people. Servants, groundskeeper, the older woman, who came on Tuesdays to handle the linen, while Gideon attended to his business, and his accounts and his correspondence and the particular social world of a successful mill owner in a prosperous Connecticut town. She had kept the books he never asked her about. She had managed the kitchen accounts and the seasonal staff, and the small disputes that arose in any house where people lived closely together. She had overseen the repair of the east wing roof when the contractor had tried to pass off inferior timber, and had caught it herself by reading the supply manifest against the bill of materials, a discrepancy of $11.40, that Gideon had nodded at when she mentioned it, and then returned to his newspaper. He had not asked how she knew. He had not asked where she'd learned to read a supply manifest. He simply nodded, the way you nod when something has been handled correctly, and you see no particular reason to understand the method. She was his wife. The house ran. These things were connected, and beyond that he had not troubled himself to inquire. The letter on the table said, in the careful handwriting of a man named Preston Lowe, that the arrangement had proceeded as discussed, that the Farmington property had been assessed, that Gideon's plan to relocate the mill operations to Pennsylvania and sell the Connecticut holdings was, in Lowe's estimation, both sound and timely, given the favorable terms currently available in the western counties. The Farmington property, the house she had managed for 4 years, the house she had repaired and organized and maintained, as though it were something that would last. As though she were building something. He had not told her. He had written to Lowe about it in detail, the assessment, the timeline, the terms. And he had not said one word to her. Winifred sat at the breakfast table and looked at the letter for a long time. The tea went cold. Outside, she could hear the groundskeeper's cart on the gravel drive, the sound of the kitchen door, the ordinary noises of a house going about its morning. A house that was, apparently, already for sale. She set the letter down and went to find Gideon. He was in his study, the door open, reading something at his desk with the comfortable absorption of a man who has not yet been interrupted. Preston Lowe's letter was on your desk, she said from the doorway. She did not go in. Gideon looked up. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, more like recalculation. You read it. He said. I did. He set his reading down. He laced his fingers together on the desk in the deliberate way he had of composing himself before a conversation he would have preferred not to have. I was going to tell you. When? A pause. When the details were settled. The letter says the assessment has already occurred. The property has already been valued. She kept her voice even. She had spent 4 years keeping her voice even, and she was beginning to understand that this had not served her particularly well. What details remain? Gideon looked at her with the expression she had come to know very well over 4 years. Not impatient, not dismissive, simply remote. As though she were a problem he was trying to solve rather than a person he was trying to speak to. There are legal matters, he said. Financial matters. It isn't a simple process. I understand financial matters, Winifred said. I've been managing yours for 4 years. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise. Closer to the look of a man who has never particularly doubted himself and has just been presented with information that doesn't quite fit the map he's been using. Winnie, he said, and the use of the shortened name, the casual familiar diminishment of it, landed on her like a hand on a shoulder pushing down gently but insistently. Don't, she said, not loudly, just clearly. He stopped. You are selling the house, she said. You are moving the mill. You made these decisions without speaking to me, without asking, without even. She paused and then continued, more quietly. I have kept this house, Gideon. I have kept it and managed it and made it run properly for 4 years, and you are selling it as though it has nothing to do with me. As though I am an item in it. A piece of furniture to be moved or left behind depending on the terms. Gideon was quiet. Were you going to ask me to come to Pennsylvania? She asked. Or was that also a detail to be settled later? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She turned and walked back down the corridor. She did not go upstairs. She went to the kitchen instead, because the kitchen was the one room in the house where she had always felt most clearly herself. Not Mrs. Alcott, not Gideon's wife, not the daughter of the Hartford merchant who had needed rescuing, but simply Winifred, who understood how things worked and what they cost, and where the numbers went wrong. She sat at the kitchen table after the cook had gone out to the garden, and she pressed both hands flat on the worn wood, and breathed. She was 27 years old. She had $9 of her own, set aside from the household accounts in small amounts over the course of 2 years, never enough to be noticed, a habit she had begun without entirely knowing why, the way some part of her had apparently understood something her mind had not yet admitted. She had the clothes on her back, and a trunk of personal items, and a complete working knowledge of how to run a house she was about to no longer have. She also had her mother's cousin, a woman named Harriet, not a cousin by blood, but by the particular loyalty of 2 women who had grown up in the same town and kept faith with each other across 30 years, and 2 marriages, and considerable distance. Harriet lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, a day's ride north. She had written to Winifred 3 times in the past year, letters that arrived with a particular careful quality, as though Harriet was asking questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. How are you, truly? Does he listen to you? Do you have somewhere to go if you need it? Winifred had answered each letter with the kind of cheerful competence that said nothing, and said it very thoroughly. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, the one she used for household tallies, and opened it to a blank page. She wrote 3 things. The first was Harriet's address. The second was the name of her mother's solicitor in Hartford, a man named Mr. Abelson, who was old and slow and absolutely trustworthy, and who had handled her father's affairs before the collapse, and who, she believed, still held something she needed to ask him about. The third was a figure, the total of what she had set aside over 2 years, plus what remained of the household discretionary fund she managed, which technically belonged to Gideon, but which she had kept and recorded, and could account for down to the last cent. She closed the notebook. She put it back in her pocket. Then she went upstairs and packed her trunk. She had been packing for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard Gideon's boots in the corridor. She did not stop. She was folding the last of her wool dresses when he appeared in the doorway. What are you doing? He said. It was not quite a question. I should think that's clear enough, she said. He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He was a man who was accustomed to the world arranging itself according to his preferences, not because he was wicked, but because it always had, and he had never had particular reason to question the pattern. He had the expression of a man reading a sentence in a language he was certain he spoke, and finding that the grammar has changed. Winifred. I'm not arguing with you, Gideon. She smoothed the dress and set it in the trunk. I'm not even angry. Or rather, I am, but that isn't the reason I'm leaving. She turned to face him. I'm leaving because you have spent 4 years treating this marriage as a management arrangement, which perhaps it was, from the beginning, for both of us, but I managed my end of it genuinely. I managed it as though it mattered, and you have just shown me clearly that you did not. He said nothing. When the house sells, she said, And your ledgers are balanced. I think you will find that the sum spent on household maintenance was rather less than the industry average for a property of this size and staff. She had looked this up. She had looked it up 18 months ago, when she first began to understand what she was doing and what it was worth. That difference represents my work. I don't expect to be paid for it. I am simply telling you that it existed and that you never once asked about it. Gideon stood in the doorway. I'll need the carriage to the Farmington Road, she said. Just to the road. I can arrange the rest. He did not argue. That was the thing she would think about later, lying awake in a different room in a different house, with the particular insomnia of someone whose life has just changed shapes on them. He did not argue, and she could not decide if that made her angrier or relieved. Perhaps it was simply that he had nothing to argue with. The numbers were correct. They were always correct. She had made sure of that. He sent for the carriage. She left through the front door. The Farmington Road in October was cold and clear, the kind of New England morning that smells of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the particular exhaustion of a season ending. Winifred sat in the carriage with her trunk and her notebook and $9, and the address in Northampton written in her own hand, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not grief. Not yet. Something that came before grief, or perhaps alongside it. The feeling of a window opened in a room that has been closed too long. The cold air uncomfortable, but real. More real than anything she had felt in a great while. She had the driver let her out at the crossroads where the stage north departed, because she had decided that morning, while packing, that she would not go directly to Harriet. There was something else first. Hartford. Mr. Abelson. The question she had been not quite asking herself for 2 years. She arrived in Hartford in the early afternoon, and walked to Abelson's office from the stage stop, which was 4 blocks and manageable, though her trunk was not light. The office was on a narrow street above a printing shop and smelled of paper and tobacco and old binding. Mr. Abelson himself was 70 if he was a day, and he looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has seen everything and is no longer particularly surprised by any of it. Mrs. Alcott, he said, or are you returning to Hargrove? I haven't decided yet, she said honestly, but I have a question about my grandmother. He set his spectacles down. Winifred's grandmother on her mother's side had been a woman named Susanna, who had died when Winifred was 12, and who she remembered primarily as a small, sharp-eyed woman who smelled of lavender and had opinions about everything, and expressed them without particular concern for whether her opinions were welcome. Susanna had run a small dry goods operation in New Haven for 30 years, longer than most men in that business managed, and she had done it with the particular combination of stubbornness and arithmetic that Winifred had only recently begun to recognize as her own inheritance. What question? Abelson said. When my grandmother died, Winifred said, did she leave anything in my name, specifically? Not my mother's name. Mine. Abelson was quiet for a moment. He looked at her steadily. Then he stood and went to the shelves at the back of the office and pulled down a box that was old and dusty and had clearly not been touched in some time. He opened it on the desk between them. Your grandmother, he said, came to me in 1818. You were 9 years old. She wanted to make an arrangement that her daughter, your mother, couldn't interfere with. He looked at the papers in the box. Susanna Hargrove had a clear understanding of what happened to women's property when they married. Your mother had already married your father by then. Susanna didn't trust what your father would do with anything she left outright. He turned a document toward her. Winifred leaned forward and read. Her grandmother had left her a building, a small commercial property on a side street in New Haven, which had been generating rental income for 11 years from a succession of tenants, a tailor, then a bookbinder, then currently a woman, sold candles and dried herbs, and had been there for 3 years and had never once been late with rent. The income had been accumulating in a separate account under Abelson's management because there was no named beneficiary yet of legal age with knowledge of the arrangement. You turned 21 and married in the same year, Abelson said. Under law, any property transferred to you after marriage would belong to your husband. Your grandmother's arrangement was specifically structured to prevent that. How? Winifred said. The trust cannot be transferred to you until you appear before me unaccompanied by a husband or husband's representative in full legal capacity and claim it by name. He looked at her over his spectacles. Your grandmother's words. She wrote the condition herself. Winifred sat back. How long have you been waiting? She said. 11 years, he said, since you married. She looked at the papers, the building, the accumulated rent, the account. She didn't know me, she said. Not really. I was 9. She knew herself at 9, Abelson said. She said that was enough. Winifred pressed her hand flat on the document. She felt for the second time that day the particular sensation of the ground shifting not away from her but toward her, rearranging itself into something she could stand on. "What do I need to do?" she said. She was in Hartford for 2 days while Abelson prepared the paperwork. She stayed at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was large and competent and asked no questions beyond what Winifred required for breakfast. Winifred slept more soundly those 2 nights than she had in 4 years, which told her something about what sleep had been costing her. On the second afternoon, she walked to New Haven. It was 8 miles, which was too far, but she had the money now for a hired ride, and she did not take it because she wanted the time, and because the October air was cold and clear, and she needed to think without walls around her. She was 2 miles out of Hartford when she heard a horse behind her and stepped to the side of the road. The horse slowed. The rider was a woman, which surprised her briefly. A woman of perhaps 40, on a steady gray mare, carrying a leather satchel across the saddle. She had the particular unhurried manner of someone accustomed to traveling alone and comfortable with it. "New Haven?" the woman asked. "Yes," Winifred said. "I'm going through. You're welcome to ride behind if you don't mind the pace." Winifred looked at her. She had learned over the past 2 days to look at people differently than she had in 4 years of managing Gideon's household, where her assessments had always been made with an eye toward smoothing things over, managing impressions, making sure no one's comfort was disrupted. Now she looked at this woman and saw only what was there: a calm face, capable hands. No performance. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." The woman's name was Margaret Fenn. She was a teacher, she said, though the word covered a great deal of territory. She had a school in Northampton, which was not a school in the formal sense but operated as one. Women coming and going on their own schedules to learn what they needed. Reading, primarily, and accounting, and the particular practical knowledge of legal documents that most women never encountered until it was too late to do anything with them. "I've been in Hartford for a lawsuit," Margaret said. "Not mine. A former student's. Her late husband's brother was contesting the estate. We won. You helped her. I helped her understand what she was entitled to. The understanding was the hard part." Margaret guided the horse around a rut in the road. "Most women don't lack intelligence. They lack information. And the people who have the information have generally benefited from keeping it scarce." Winifred was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother left me a building," she said. She had not said it aloud to anyone yet. "I just found out this morning. She left it to me 11 years ago and kept it in trust, because she knew my husband would have absorbed it otherwise." Margaret looked at her sideways. Was she right? Winifred thought about Gideon, about the letter from Preston Lowe, about the house being assessed and the terms being settled, and the details she would have been told about later when the details were arranged. "Yes," she said. "She was right. Clever woman. I never fully appreciated that about her," Winifred said. "While she was alive, most of us don't appreciate the right things in people until we find out we've inherited them," Margaret said simply. They rode in comfortable silence for a mile. Then Margaret said, "What are you going to do with it? The building?" "I don't know yet," Winifred said honestly. "I have some ideas. They're still rough. Rough ideas are the right kind to have at this stage," Margaret said. "Finished ideas are harder to change." They parted ways at the edge of New Haven. Margaret pressed a card into her hand before she went, a small white card with a Northampton address and nothing else on it. "If you find yourself in the north," Margaret said, "come by. We could use someone who understands accounts." Winifred held the card for a moment. "I was planning to visit someone in Northampton," she said. "A cousin of my mother's. Her name is Harriet." Margaret looked at her. A slow recognition moved across her face. "Harriet Morse, you know her. She sends me students," Margaret said. "She has for years." She gathered the reins. "Tell her I said you arrived." She rode north. Winifred watched her go, and then turned and walked into New Haven, with the card in her pocket, and the particular feeling of a woman who is beginning to understand the shape of a world she had not previously been permitted to see. She found the building on a Tuesday. It was a corner property, narrow and old but soundly built, with a green door and a window that caught the afternoon light well and a sign above the lintel that read, in faded letters, "Candles and Sundries." Inside, a woman of perhaps 50 was arranging dried bundles on a shelf with the methodical satisfaction of someone who has found her right work. Her name was Mrs. Ogilvy, and when Winifred introduced herself as the new owner, Mrs. Ogilvy looked at her for a long time and then said, "Your grandmother used to come by." Winifred went still. She did not often. Once a year or so in the later years, she would come and sit in that chair. Mrs. Ogilvy nodded toward a wooden chair near the window. She never said much, just looked around. A pause. She seemed satisfied. Winifred sat in the chair. The afternoon light came through the window the way it must have come through for 11 years of Tuesday afternoons, when a small sharp-eyed woman sat here and looked at something that was hers and would pass to someone who needed it. She sat there for a long time. She was still in New Haven when a messenger arrived from Hartford with a letter. It was from Gideon. The handwriting was careful and composed, the way all of Gideon's writing was careful and composed, because Gideon was a man who did not let untidy things show in his correspondence, any more than he let them show anywhere else. He wrote that he had spoken to his solicitor. He wrote that under the terms of their marriage agreement, Winifred was entitled to a settlement of $200 upon formal separation, which he was prepared to offer without dispute. He wrote that he presumed she had found alternative arrangements, and that if she had not, the matter of her domestic situation could be discussed further. He did not ask where she was. He did not ask if she was safe. He did not write that he was sorry, though she had not expected him to, because Gideon was a man who did not apologize for things he had genuinely not understood were wrong. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript that had clearly been added after some consideration, he wrote, "You were right that the household expenses were below the district average. I checked the figures. I don't know that I fully understood, before, what that required." It was not an apology. It was Gideon's version of one. An acknowledgement of arithmetic. She understood that and did not dismiss it. She wrote back one letter. It was short. She thanked him for the settlement offer, accepted it, and told him that she was in New Haven and intended to remain. She told him that the building in question was not a piece of his estate, and that her solicitor Mr. Abelson could confirm the legal details at his convenience. She told him that she wished him well in Pennsylvania, which was true, and that she hoped the new operation was profitable, which was also true. She did not tell him about the chair by the window or Susanna's annual visits, or the particular quality of the afternoon light. Those were not things she owed him. She sent the letter and turned back to the account books Mrs. Ogilvy had maintained for 3 years, because the first thing to understand about anything you own is where the money goes and where it comes from, and whether the two columns are honest with each other. She spent 2 days going through the books. On the third day, Margaret Fenn arrived. She appeared at the green door in the late morning, satchel over her shoulder, as though she had simply been passing. She had not, Winifred was fairly certain, simply been passing. She had come down from Northampton, which was a deliberate journey, and she had come because Harriet Morse had written to her, which Winifred understood without being told. "How is it?" Margaret asked, meaning the building, and also meaning something larger than the building. "The accounts are clean," Winifred said. "Mrs. Ogilvy is honest and careful, and has been losing money on her candle stock because she charges less than the market will bear. I've been going through the supply costs with her." Margaret set her satchel down and sat in the wooden chair without being invited, which Winifred found she didn't mind. "What else?" Margaret said. "The building needs work on the east side. The timber framing is sound but the plaster is cracking." She had looked at this herself, because she had been reading surveying texts for 2 years, and knew enough to walk a perimeter and identify what needed attention. "A stonemason told me it's a 2-week job. Not expensive given the rest of the structure is solid." "Your grandmother built to last," Margaret said. "She did." Winifred sat across from her. Outside the window, the New Haven street was going about its afternoon. A cart, a woman with a basket, 2 men in conversation outside a tailor's shop. Ordinary witnessed. Real. "I've been thinking about the upper floor." The upper floor of the building was currently storage. It had been storage for 11 years, boxes of goods Mrs. Ogilvy could not sell and items left by previous tenants, accumulated in the particular way of spaces no one has claimed. "It's large enough for a room," Winifred said. "A proper room with windows. What I've been thinking is..." She paused. Margaret waited. "There are women in this town who manage household accounts, as I did, who keep books for their husbands' businesses, as I did, because they have the skill for it, and who are never credited for it and don't know what they're doing is worth something beyond the household." She looked at Margaret steadily. "What if the upper room was a place where they could learn that it is? Where they could learn accounts properly, and legal reading, and what their skills are worth in a world where they're permitted to use them?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Harriet told me you were good," she said. "I haven't done anything yet," Winifred said. "You've done quite a lot," Margaret said. "You just haven't had anyone tell you it counted." She picked up her satchel. I have 3 women in Northampton who have been asking me where to send someone who needs accounting instruction. I've been telling them I don't know yet. She looked at Winifred directly. Now I do. The first woman came in November. Her name was Cassandra Dowd. Not a name she had chosen, she said with the flat amusement of someone who has made peace with a thing they cannot change. And she was 31 and had been keeping the books for her husband's cooperage for 6 years without being consulted about a single business decision, those books informed. He tells me I wouldn't understand the business side, she said, sitting at the table in the upper room, which Winifred had cleared and furnished with 2 chairs and a proper writing desk and the afternoon light that was the room's best quality. What do you understand? Winifred asked. Cassandra looked at her. Everything, she said. I understand everything, I just didn't know what to do with that. Let's start there then, Winifred said. They started there. Gideon's second letter arrived in early December, more unexpected than the first. It was longer, which surprised her, because Gideon was not a man who wrote long letters. He wrote from Philadelphia, where the mill operation was being established, and he wrote with the particular halting quality of a man attempting to say something he has not previously tried to say in words. He said that Preston Lowe had asked after her. He said that the new house in Philadelphia was larger than he'd anticipated, and that he had not yet furnished the parlor, because he found he did not know how to do it properly, which she gathered was his way of observing, without quite stating, that the 4 years in Connecticut had been managed in ways he had not fully noticed until they were no longer occurring. He said that he had spoken to his own cousin, a man named Arthur, who had apparently and recently had a conversation with his own wife that Gideon characterized as overdue, and that Arthur had told him something Gideon found difficult to disagree with, which was that a man who measures the value of a marriage by what it cost him has already made a fundamental error in his accounting. It was not the sentence of a man who had changed. It was the sentence of a man who was perhaps beginning to understand that there was something to change. There was a difference, and Winifred knew it. She wrote back briefly. She thanked him for the letter. She told him that the building in New Haven was hers outright, and that she intended to remain. She told him that she hoped Arthur's conversation had been useful. She told him, because it was true, and because she found she was done with dishonesty, even when dishonesty would have been kinder, that she did not wish him ill, and that she hoped the Philadelphia mill was everything he had planned for it to be. She told him that she would not be waiting to hear whether it was. She folded the letter and addressed it and gave it to the mail boy, and went back upstairs to where Cassandra was working through a set of cooperage accounts. Her head bent over the page, her pen moving with the particular steady confidence of someone learning that what they already knew was real. By February, there were 4 women using the upper room. By March, there were 7. They came from the town and from the surrounding townships, some of them referred by Margaret, some by Harriet Morse, some by the particular invisible network that seemed to exist among women who understood something needed to exist and passed the information to each other in the careful way of people carrying something fragile over uncertain ground. Winifred taught accounts. She taught legal document reading, the kind she had learned from Abelson and from her own 2 years of borrowing Gideon's surveying texts and teaching herself the vocabulary. She did not pretend to know everything. She said clearly when she didn't know something and then found out and came back with the answer, because that was how her father had taught her to approach a ledger, and she found it applied to most things. Mrs. Ogilvy brought tea at 3 o'clock and did not charge for it, which Winifred noted in the accounts and set against the rent as a credit, which made Mrs. Ogilvy laugh the first time she saw it. You could just call it a kindness, Mrs. Ogilvy said. I can call it a kindness and still record it, Winifred said. Everything that has value deserves to be recorded. That's rather the point. On a Thursday morning in April, when the light was returning to New England the way it does in spring with the particular insistence of something that has been kept back too long, Winifred opened the record book she had started in November and read through the names. 14 women, as of that week, their skills, their situations, what they had learned, what they had done with it. A woman in Middletown who had used the accounting instruction to contest a supplier's invoice at her husband's hardware store, and 1. A woman in Hamden who had discovered, with Abelson's help, Winifred had given out his address 3 times now, that her late father had left her a land interest that her brother had been collecting income from for 5 years without her knowledge. She read through the names the way her grandmother must have read through the columns in her account books. The same arithmetic. Different sums. She had not heard from Gideon since December, which was how she had asked it to be. And which was how it was, because Gideon was, whatever else he was, a man who honored the terms of an arrangement once they had been clearly stated. She found that she could appreciate that about him, now that the arrangement in question was on her terms. She was 27 years old. She had a building in New Haven, paid off by income her grandmother had accumulated for her across 11 years of quiet, deliberate faith in a granddaughter she had known at 9 and trusted by 80. She had an upper room full of women, learning that their competence was not a secret to be managed, but a fact to be used. She had Harriet's letters from Northampton and Margaret's occasional visits, and Mrs. Ogilvy's tea at 3 o'clock. She had more than she had brought to Gideon's house 4 years ago, and considerably more than she had carried out of it. She turned to a blank page in the record book. She picked up her pen. She wrote her grandmother's name at the top. Susanna Hargrove. Then she wrote the date. Then she wrote, in the careful hand her father had taught her, and which she had never stopped practicing, even in the years when the only ledgers available to her were someone else's, the names of the women who had sat in the upper room that week, what they had learned, what they intended to do with it. She wrote them down the way Susanna had built the building, not for now, for after. For whoever came through the door next and needed to find out that the ground was there, and solid, and had been waiting for them all along. She closed the book. She stood up. She walked to the window of the upper room and looked out at the April street, at the green door below her, at the sign above the lintel she had repainted the previous month in clear letters. Hargrove House. Not Alcott, not Mrs. Somebody's something. Her name. Her grandmother's name. The one that had been there before the marriage and had survived it, and was here now, on a building on a corner in New Haven, recorded in a county document in her own hand, unchallengeable and permanent. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. She felt the cold of it, and the morning light coming through it, and the particular aliveness of a woman who has stopped arranging herself around someone else's plans and started making her own. She was exactly who she had always been. It had just taken 4 years of quiet, and one open letter, and a grandmother's stubborn faith, to bring her back to herself, and she intended, starting now, to make it count.